The Lost Souls of Tromelin Island. Chapter 1. The Fateful Voyage. The Luteal, a French ship, sailed through the sapphire waters of the Indian Ocean in late July 1761. On board, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The crew of French sailors manned the deck, while beneath, packed tightly in the hold, were over 150 enslaved Malagasy people from Madagascar, destined for the French colonies in Mauritius. Captain Jean de Lafargue stood tall at the helm, his stern face fixed on the horizon. He had been warned about the treacherous waters near the coral reefs of the region, but time was money. Ignoring the advice of his experienced navigator, the captain steered the ship along a perilous route in a bid to save a few days' travel. Below deck, the conditions were dire. The Malagasy captives, chained and terrified, whispered to one another in their native tongue. Among them, a young man named Rassoa watched the small beams of light trickling through the cracks in the ship's planks. He prayed for deliverance, a freedom that seemed as distant as the stars in the night sky. That night, as the ship pushed through the dark waters, the air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The wind shifted, and without warning, the ship shuddered. A sickening crunch echoed across the deck, followed by the cries of panicked men. The Luteal had struck something hard. Chapter 2. The Shipwreck. The Luteal had slammed into the hidden coral reefs of a desolate island, Tromelin, an uncharted piece of land barely visible on the ocean's surface. Waves pounded the hull, tearing the ship apart with each brutal strike. Rassoa, chained to the lower deck, was thrust into chaos. Water surged into the hold, and he, along with the other Malagasy, fought desperately to free themselves. Amid the crashing waves and splintering wood, they worked feverishly to break their shackles. Above deck, the French sailors were in disarray. Captain de Lafargue barked orders, but the ship was sinking fast. There was no time, no hope of saving the vessel. Amid the screams and roaring ocean, Rassoa and several others finally broke free, scrambling through the waterlogged ship as it disintegrated around them. One by one, they plunged into the cold, churning sea, struggling towards the barely visible shore of Tromelin. By morning, only the wreckage of the Luteal remained, scattered across the reef. About 80 French sailors and 120 Malagasy had survived the night, washed up on the small, barren island, surrounded by the wreck of their hopes. Chapter 3. The Island of Despair. Tromelin was no paradise. The survivors found themselves on a bare patch of coral and sand, no more than 1,700 meters long and 700 meters wide. There were no trees, no fresh water, no shelter, just a cruel sun beating down on them and the relentless waves crashing against the shore. Captain de Lafargue, still in command, ordered his sailors to begin constructing a raft from the wreckage of the ship. He had no intention of staying on this island any longer than necessary. Meanwhile, the Malagasy survivors, including Rassoa, were left to fend for themselves. Though free of their chains, they were still treated as slaves by the French. Rassoa watched as the sailors took control of the limited food supplies, what little remained from the wreck, and rationed it among themselves. The Malagasy, left with scraps, scoured the beach for anything that might sustain them: driftwood, seaweed, and crabs. Days turned into weeks. The raft took shape slowly under the harsh sun, but hope was dwindling. The island offered no shelter from the elements, no fresh water to drink. Desperation began to creep into the minds of the survivors. Chapter 4. The Betrayal. The raft was finally completed. Captain de Lafargue stood proudly by it, his eyes set on the horizon. The French sailors prepared to leave, eager to escape the cursed island. "We'll come back for you," the captain said, his voice ringing hollow in the salty air as he addressed the Malagasy. "You'll be rescued soon." But Rassoa and the others had little faith in the captain's words. They had seen too much of the cruelty of men like him. The raft could barely hold the French sailors, let alone the Malagasy. And when the time came to board, the Frenchmen did so without a second glance at those they were leaving behind. As the raft drifted out to sea, Rassoa stood with the others on the shore, watching the tiny vessel disappear into the distance. For the first time, they were truly alone. Chapter 5, Stranded. Days turned into weeks, and still no sign of rescue. The raft had vanished into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, leaving the Malagasy behind with nothing but the harsh sun and the unforgiving sea. Rasoa and his people were left with no choice but to fight for survival. The island offered little in the way of resources, but the Malagasy were resourceful. They built makeshift shelters from the driftwood and palm leaves, and they devised ways to capture rainwater in hollowed-out shells and remnants of the wreck. Hunger gnawed at their bellies as the days stretched on. Rasoa led the others in scavenging what little food the island provided: crabs, birds' eggs, and the occasional fish. They were growing weaker with each passing day, but they refused to give in to despair. Chapter 6, A World Forgotten. Months passed. The French never returned. The Malagasy survivors became ghosts on the island, living day by day, sustained by sheer will. Their skin was burned by the sun, their bodies weakened by hunger, but they clung to life. Rasoa, though thin and worn, kept the others going with his quiet determination. He had not forgotten his home, his family in Madagascar. The dreams of returning to them fueled his every step, every small victory over the harsh environment of Tromelin. But the world had forgotten about them. The island was too remote, too insignificant to be found by passing ships. It was as though the Malagasy had disappeared from the face of the earth. Chapter 7, Hope on the Horizon. One morning, as Rasoa was gathering driftwood, he spotted something unusual on the horizon, a dark speck, barely visible. His heart quickened. Could it be a ship? He rushed to alert the others. Together they gathered on the shore, watching, waiting. The speck grew larger, and soon it became clear. A ship was approaching. The survivors lit fires and waved frantically, their voices hoarse with shouts of hope. The ship drew closer, and finally it anchored near the island. The French had returned. Chapter 8, The Return of the French. It had been 15 long years since the Luteal had wrecked on Tromelin, and in that time, only a handful of the Malagasy had survived. When the French sailors landed, they were shocked to find people still living on the island. The Malagasy, though emaciated and weather-beaten, stood with dignity as they greeted the men who had once abandoned them. Rasoa, now an elder in the small group of survivors, faced the newcomers with quiet strength. The French sailors brought food and water, and for the first time in years, the survivors tasted fresh water and bread. The rescue had finally come, but the cost had been immeasurable. Chapter 9, The Last Days on Tromelin. The French sailors worked to evacuate the survivors from Tromelin, but it was a slow process. Rasoa and the others watched as the remnants of their makeshift homes were packed up, their last ties to the island that had been their prison for so long. As they prepared to leave, Rasoa stood on the shore, gazing out at the ocean. The island had taken so much from him, but it had also given him something: a fierce resilience, a sense of freedom that no man could ever again take from him. Chapter 10, A World Remembered. The survivors were taken to Mauritius, where they were given freedom in recognition of their incredible endurance. Rasoa, free at last, walked among the bustling streets of the city, but his heart remained on Tromelin. The story of Tromelin Island in the Malagasy, who survived there for 15 years, would be remembered as a testament to human endurance, a haunting reminder of the cost of colonialism and the indomitable will to survive. As Rasoa looked up at the endless sky, he knew that Tromelin would never be forgotten, not by him and not by history,